Okay, so your last video on meteorology. Okay, so we're going to talk about climate zones. You've already done weather maps, so that's half of it already being done. Okay, let me pause this. Okay, so climate is defined as your general conditions of temperature and precipitation over a long period of time. The SOL, your test, will ask you what are the two components of climate, so you have to know that it's temperature and precipitation. What this is showing you is what we've talked about, that equilibrium. That the Earth is always striving for equilibrium. It's trying to balance the incoming solar radiation with the outgoing radiation. The fact that you'll have a global warming followed by a global cooling. We'll watch that in class. Okay, so the three things that affect temperature. Latitude, obviously. The closer you are to the equator, the warmer it is. Your elevation. I think you guys know this too. Your distance above sea level, if you're up on the top of a high mountain, it's going to be cold. Ocean currents, again, you experience this, you live in Virginia Beach. It controls our temperature in the way that areas away from the ocean get colder before we do, and they also get warmer before we do. Okay, and more specifically, let me point out, the current is very specific. This is true for us, what I just said, because we are in a body of water, the section of the ocean that actually moves up from Florida. But if we were on the Pacific coast, it would be coming down from Alaska, and so the water there would be cold. Okay, sorry about that. All right, it says if you're located near the equator, high up in a mountain, how would you describe your climate? Is it going to be wet weather or dry weather? Do you think it's going to be hot or cold? So try to decide what you think. Oh, I thought the answer was on there, I guess not. So at the top of a mountain, it's going to be wet. You're going to have snow and it's going to be cold. It doesn't matter if you're near the equator. Okay, it says large bodies of water can affect the climate. We just talked about this. They're absorbing or giving off heat, so they do control the weather from changing so quickly. All right, the temperature zones, make sure you pay attention to where Virginia Beach falls. Virginia Beach falls under the no dry season. Okay, so we don't ever have like a drought season. Okay, the three things that affect precipitation rates. Global winds, remember, it determines where your weather's coming from. Is it coming off the land? Is it coming off the water? Warm air can hold more moisture than cold air. Remember, we've already talked about a land breeze and a sea breeze, but let's just go over it again. A land breeze is going to carry less water than a sea breeze. It says a region with little to no precipitation is called a desert. You need to know that they're always around 30 degrees north and south. So it says even if the wind direction allows a desert, the wind direction, let me go back, can allow a desert to exist near a large body of water if the wind is constantly coming off the land. So if it were to switch and it was constantly coming off the water, you wouldn't have a desert there. Okay, precipitation map. You can see where we fall, 40 to 60 inches per year. It says in the early spring, it's forecasted to be 80 degrees in Williamsburg. Is our local temperature in Virginia Beach likely to be lower, higher, or the same? The truth is the ocean will still be cold, so we will have a lower temperature. Okay, this is called a microclimate, little areas that are relatively near the same latitude and longitude, but because we aren't exactly at the same spot, because some of us are closer to water than others, you have microclimates. Large cities can affect the local climate. It says streets, parking lots, and buildings heat up so they can keep heat inside the city. Air pollution traps heat in. The orographic effect, we're talking about mountains. So it says when moist air pushes against a mountain, it comes up one side, moist and warm. Okay, so it's holding all the water. When it gets to the top, it lets it all out, comes down cold and dry. You should rewind that and draw a little diagram with a mountain that shows the air coming up on one side, warm and wet, and coming down the mountain on the other side as cold and dry. Here's a little diagram that shows it. So the mountain range acts as a barrier. You have the windward side, which is on the west side in the United States, and you have the leeward side, or the rain shadow desert, on the right side, the east side in the United States. So this area, because it's constantly getting cold and dry air, forms a rain shadow desert. Again, just another diagram showing this to you. On your, this should say cold and dry air though, instead of warm and dry. In this orange, you should have it say cold and dry. On your test, you'll have to label that. So which side of the Blue Ridge Mountains are we on, the leeward or the windward? Hopefully you said leeward. How does it affect our weather? If you remember that big storm system that was coming and I told you, don't worry, it will break up in the mountains, that's exactly what I was talking about. Okay, there are 3 temperature zones. So let me go to the picture first. Here's the picture. You might want to draw it. So you have your tropical zone in the middle towards the equator, then your temperate zone. Temperate meaning changing. Okay, if somebody said you were temperamental, it meant that you had lots of moods. You were touchy. So these are where you get seasons. Anybody in the temperate zone. And then your polar zones are always cold. So let's go back. Polar zone is from 60 to 90. It has the coldest average temperature. They really don't have a summer, very little rain or precipitation. Even though there's always snow, it's just because the snow hasn't melted or sublimated. The temperate zone, let me move this, 60 to 30 degrees. The temperature here varies. Think about the United States. We're in the temperate zone. You have people up in New York that have long winters all the way down to people in Florida with no winters. Okay, so the farther away you are from the equator, the bigger the winter. The closer you are, the more rain you have, the hotter it is. Okay, so it can be very sporadic. It says the deserts in this area are not always hot. They can be cool to freezing at night. Gives you an example. The tropical zone is from 0 to 30 degrees. High humidity, high temperature. The warmest temps, they have no winters. The deserts exist on the western coast there on the leeward side of the mountain. Remember, at this point, they're in the trade wind, so it's coming from the opposite side. Their wind is coming from the east to the west. Okay, biomes, you learned these in 7th grade. The ones I want you to know for sure, the tundra. Oops, I'll choose yellow. It says extremely cold and dry. It's a cold desert. Think about Alaska. Your deciduous forest, this is where we are, where the trees shed their leaves. You already know what a tropical rainforest is, a grassland, a desert. I think you know those things. The coniferous forest, go ahead and know that. Conifers, we're talking about can't even talk. Coniferous forest, cone-bearing trees like pines. That's what I meant to say. I put it all together, sorry. So few trees except for the conifers. This is also parts of Alaska, actually, a lot of the northern states too. Okay, marine versus continental. When you live close to the water, you have more rain, only though if your wind is coming off the water. Your summers are not as hot and your winters are not as cold because that water is controlling your temperature. The further you are inland, you have drier, hotter summers and colder winters. Okay, ice ages. We've had 4 major ice ages in the last 2 million years. We call those events major glaciations. You don't have to know the average temp and when the most recent one was. We will talk about these when we get into historical geology. But you should know that the great sheets of ice moved all the way down into Michigan, Iowa, Nebraska, New York, and they formed the Great Lakes and the Finger Lakes. So we will talk more in depth in class as to how they actually form. We also have little ice ages. The last one was started around 1500, lasted going into 1900. It was really the late 1800s. As far as those little ones go, we don't really know exactly where they come from. It's just a climate pattern that the Earth has. And the time period between ice ages is called interglacial. Okay, El Nino typically shows up every 4 years, but not always. It's not that predictable. The way that they know that it's coming is that right around Christmas, suddenly lots of fish die and wash up on the shore in California, and they know that the water that's normally cold has suddenly turned warm. And what El Nino does is it brings about severe droughts in areas that normally have rain, heavy rains and floods in areas that normally don't have rain. It causes crazy weather patterns, and this actually we had this last year. La Nina is the year that follows it. And so actually we are coming out of La Nina. So it was actually more than a year ago for El Nino. La Nina is the exact opposite. So it's extremely cold weather that you're not used to. Maybe that winter we had last year is a result of La Nina. Right, so if you look here in a normal year, you can see where the jet stream is. In an El Nino year, it's up very high, bringing the Mexico wind currents up further into the states. The warm water is now closer than it normally is. Okay, when you look at La Nina versus El Nino, you can see they're almost exact opposites. So again, the Earth is trying to keep that equilibrium and protect itself, regain exactly what it had. Sorry again. Okay, so try these. It says you're located high in the mountains at the equator in September. So consider where you're located and the time of year. Number 2 says you're located roughly at 45 degrees north. That would be where we are, near water in May. You're located roughly at 45 degrees south on the leeward side of a mountain in December. Careful with that one. You're located at 45 degrees north on the windward side of a mountain in May. Take a second, see if you can figure those out. The answer is on the next slide, so you might want to pause it. Go ahead and check your answers and see if you are correct. All right, so that's everything that's left for meteorology, and I'm sure at least, 10 of you have decided to be meteorologists. Just kidding.